And we'll get started. So this is Anyone Can Be a Civic Tech Hero. We're obviously going to talk about how every one of you can get into civic technology. We're going to talk about my journey a little bit. But first I want to start with just a really simple fact. All of you benefit from government technology. You might not understand that or realize that, but you do. Anyone ever go through an airport, ever? Yeah, so, you know, all those security checks, all that technology, that's tons of civic technology. It's not just about safety and security, though, of course. It's also about our roads and infrastructure, right? All those sensors that we have on bridges, guess who runs that? The government. It's civic technology. But it goes way beyond that. So we all benefit from this civic technology. And the thing is, that civic technology is created by the people that show up. And that's these civic tech heroes. And so I want to talk about that. And in particular, in this talk, I'm going to talk about a little journey that I made to create one little bit of civic technology. It has nothing to do with my official role, which I'll mention in just a second. It was actually just something I did on my personal time to solve one person's problem, and that kind of grew into something else. So who am I? I am Jordan Kasper. I'm a senior advisor in the Office of the Chief Information Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. What does that mean? Well, I advise on a lot of things. I actually don't do anything in the sense that I don't own any programs or projects or technology. I don't lead any teams. There's literally no one under me. It's just me talking to the CIO about what we should be working on, and then I go and insert myself into stuff. And I've been doing this for a while in government. I'm currently at Department of Homeland Security. Previous to that, I was at Deloitte for a little while, but then I was at the Department of Defense through an organization called the United States Digital Service. Anyone digital service? Hey, you got a couple of people that know about it. If you're in DC long enough, you hear about USDS eventually, and now all of you have. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. I'm a software engineer. As Steve mentioned, I also do a lot of other things, like I'm a board game enthusiast and all that good stuff. If you go to my site, jordankasper.com, you'll see all the weird stuff that I also do. So I want to talk about building civic technology, right? That's why we're here. And what I want to talk about is how we can create civic technology in 3 easy steps, right? The first step is identifying a problem. Now, this doesn't have to be a big flashy problem. It doesn't have to be how do we protect roads and bridges. It doesn't have to be how do we keep terrorists from coming into our country through our airports and our seaports and our land ports, right? It doesn't have to be that. It can just be solving one person's problem. I'm going to talk about that problem in just a little bit. And of course, you have to find some data set or some API, right? All of our applications are driven on data. Yes, we have some static websites. Chris's site is great, but let's be honest, it'd be better if there was a little data behind it, right, Chris?
That's right.
That's right. So we need to have some kind of data, and I'm going to talk about that data, and I'm specifically going to talk about open source data, and more specifically, government open source data, and of course, open source software and open APIs. And then of course, lastly, we're going to build something, right? And we're going to build an MVP, that minimally viable product. The smallest thing we can do to solve a problem. The problem we identified in number 1, right? That's what we're going to talk about. We collect feedback from those users, and then we iterate and we build and we grow. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to talk about a real world example. Again, this was done in my personal capacity. This is not an official government website that I built. It doesn't reflect my role at DHS, but all of the methods and processes are in fact things that I promote within the department. And I'm happy to talk about those afterward if anyone's interested. So the problem that we're going to talk about is with this site, regulations.gov. Now, the site itself is, I'm not going to focus too much on that. I'm going to focus a lot on the solution. But this is a really important site. Has anyone ever heard of regulations.gov before? Wow, okay. I did not expect 3 people to raise their hands. I expected 0. Carl, you don't count though. He's too government adjacent. So this is a really important site for engaging in our civic discourse when it comes to government, and in particular to rule and decision making within federal agencies. So when a federal agency wants to change a rule, they want to, end this program or expand that program or change how we spend this money or change how we restrict or promote this thing, they have to post that rule as a proposed rulemaking, and then people are able to comment on it. You've heard of public comment periods? This is where those comments all are published. This is where it all comes. You can actually make comments here, but it also publishes comments that might come in from other sources. And this is really, really important for anyone in administrative law, for example. If you're in administrative law and you're trying to do good government work, you want to know about all those comments because you want to know what everyone is saying. Really, really critical to our political discourse, to our government process, and to our public engagement with that. So I'm going to show you a screenshot of what the site looked like in January of 2021. Now, you might say, well, it's not great, but maybe it's not too bad. Except that you have to understand this is a screenshot of a Flash website. Do you remember what date I said that was? 2021. January of 2021. Does anyone know when Adobe fully, completely, 100% ceased any and all support for Flash?
19?
December of 2020 was when they said absolutely no more whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. And this is January of 2021. So, obviously, this needed to be replaced. This was originally created in 2003. It actually had a lot of useful features. And in fact, the user that I'm talking about is my wife, who happens to be an attorney and works at a nonprofit organization and explicitly deals with rulemaking and regulations in administrative law. So she used this site quite extensively. They rolled out a new site. Now I say they, that's the General Services Administration, GSA. They own this website and they rolled out a new one in February of 2021. Right, so that was January 2021, here's February. Now you might look at that and be like, cool, okay, that's a pretty standard website. Got a big call to action, big search box, that's great. You got some nice exploration tools in the bottom right there. Sure, cool, okay, this looks fine. But here's the problem. They weren't really ready for this. It was very underfunded, understaffed, and it does not, in fact, have all the features that the old site had. Now, I'm all about MVPs, I'm all about iteration, I'm all about agile development. But it's missing features that allowed for public engagement with the rulemaking process, and that's a problem. It's a massive problem because it means the people that actually care, that are actually trying to make the government better and our rules better, can't do that as effectively or even at all in some cases. And so this was a massive problem for my wife in particular. So I found a user, I found their pain points, right? So I've identified my problem, this website. Now you might say, well, what's wrong with it, right? I said features were missing. Quick example, all of the rules for the United States are published on a site called the Federal Register. Anyone actually been to the Federal Register website? Okay, one, I don't know what's wrong with you, but that's okay. The Federal Register is where you find all these rules. So if you're interested in finding a rule, by the way, you can go to the Federal Register, you can subscribe for certain topics, and then you can get notifications of, oh, there's a new rule on data standards. When you copy the docket number, which is what everything is kind of under, it's the umbrella identifier, and you paste it from the Federal Register into here, it will not find it. It will not find it because the Federal Register uses M-dashes, which are like really long hyphens. And regs.gov uses hyphens, not M-dashes. And so it doesn't find it. These are two government websites with the same identifier, and you can't find a document from one to the other. How easy would that be for anyone in this room to fix? Would that take you 30 seconds? Maybe a little longer? Might have some new developers, it might take you a couple minutes. This was launched in February of 2021, and as of last month, that problem still existed. Okay, so we've got some problems, right? We've identified our big problem, we've found a user, we've found some pain points. Let's talk about how we're going to fix that. Now, first of all, of course, we need the data, right? So we've got our pain points, but we need to find some data. So we're going to talk about data sets and we're going to talk about APIs. I want to talk about data sets. Now, in this case, a data set won't work, right? Because these are rules that are coming out constantly. They're comments that are being fed into the system constantly. We need that kind of real-time feedback, and so we really need an API for this one. And we have one, spoiler alert. But the data sets are also really important. What if it wasn't this? What if it was the nature of the environmental issue in your particular county, and someone really is concerned about that and interested, or doing maybe some NGO, some non-governmental organization work on environmental studies? There are tons of data sets out there, and I want to talk a little bit about how you might find those. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about open source government data. There is tons of data. Tons and tons of data out there that you can use to build systems, to build applications, and again, to go back to the original point, to solve a problem. You can go to data.usgs.gov. the US Geological Survey. They have hordes of data sets, everything from A to Z, abandoned mines to zinc deposit concentrations. Yes, I went and looked. They actually have everything from A to Z. You have healthdata.gov, tons of data sets about health data and medical data around the country. And a lot of these feed into another site called data.gov, and this should really be your starting point. Data.gov has thousands of open data sets from dozens of federal agencies and departments that you can make use of. A lot of those are updated very regularly. Some of them aren't. Some of them are more historical data, but a lot of those are updated very regularly. And just to feed off of that, I'm going to talk about my own organization. The Department of Homeland Security has a lot of data initiatives. So we have this big data inventory program going on right now. It's actually been going on for a while. This is congressionally mandated by the Open Government Data Act, which is, I think, a really good thing. It helps be a forcing mechanism for us to actually open source a lot of our data and do things like data inventories so that we have accurate, complete, timely, and I think most important, useful data. Stuff that actually matters. We also, of course, work to open source that data, so we're looking to put more and more data sets on data.gov. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention open data standards and the data stewardship, so that when we present a date in one data set, we present that date the same way in another data set. When we do full name in one data set, it's full name in the other data set, and we know what that looks like, we know what that means. You can find out a lot more about our data initiatives and some of our open data sets on dhs.gov/data. Okay, data's great. We talked about data, but as I mentioned before, we really need an API, right? This is real-time stuff. Luckily, there's api.data.gov. There are about 17 government organizations that host their APIs, open APIs, through api.data.gov. Anyone can get an API key. Any one of you can go there right now and register for an API key. It literally takes 1 minute. The form is super short. You'll get an email, you get an API key, you can start hitting those APIs. A lot of those are actually relatively modern. They're using modern HTTP methods, get, post, put. They're using authentication keys for that authentication in relatively good practice. A lot of them are using JSON for their data transmit format. Some of them have good documentation. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a really good place to start. So guess what I found? Regulations.gov has an API hosted on api.data.gov. So I've got that data. Now I'm ready to start building my MVP. I've listened to my users, I've gotten those pain points, I'm ready to start, I got my data. And then I started running into some pretty early pain points. And there are a couple of ones that I just could not get around. And one of them was the API key rate limits. api.data.gov is not meant for commercial use. It has a 1,000 per hour rate limit, which you might think, okay, like if I'm just doing some stuff, that's not a big problem. And it really wouldn't actually be a problem, but here's the thing, there's no commercial option. Not for normal folk like us anyway. There's no commercial option. I can't pay money to get 10,000 an hour or 20,000 an hour. I can't do that. So I have to come up with another solution. And you know, the rate limit really wouldn't be as much of a problem if it weren't for really poor data architecture and API design. Really, really poor. So, for example, we talked about dockets, right? That's what the main identifier that everything's under. Inside of that, and we'll see this a little later, there are a bunch of documents. Okay, so I make an API request for the docket and I get all the documents, right? No, you get a list of the document IDs. Okay, so then I have to make a request for each of those documents. Yes, great. Remember what I talked about though. Why do we have regs.gov? It's for the comment period, right? It's for getting all that public engagement. How many comments do you think a proposed rule at Health and Human Services might have? 10, 50, 100, 200,000? Yeah. 200,000 is about the right amount. Now I can get those comments in a paged request, about 250 a page. I don't have a calculator, so it's a lot. It's a lot of API requests. But that's actually not where it ends, because each of those comments in that 250 list doesn't have a couple of critical pieces of information for an administrative law professional to make a decision on whether they care about that comment or not. Remember, I'm solving someone's problem. Their problem is they need to see what the comments are and who's making them and why they're making them. And they can't get that from that limited metadata information that comes back in that page request. So I have to make a request for every single comment to that API at 1,000 per hour. I went back and forth with GSA for a while, by the way, trying to get them to up my limit. They upped it to 2,000 an hour for 3 months and then knocked it back down because that was a temporary period for I have no idea why. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lack of good documentation. There is documentation, but that's not what the government is really good at when it comes to technical documentation. They're really good at producing documents. Everyone knows that. They can produce lots of good documents, just not technical documents. Okay, so what do? There's a couple of things that we do. The first thing I did was I made all my users register for a key on api.data.gov. Now you might say, sure, that seems like a big burden. It's actually not. The form is 2 fields. It's your name and email. I can direct them straight to that page. They get an email right after clicking the button. It's got their API key. They paste it into their user profile on my site. It's really not that hard. And then when I make API requests, I actually make them, come on now. Nope, that's dead. They make them using their API key. So the user goes to the website. They request some data in the UI. It sends it to the Node API. I look up their user profile. I grab their API key. I use that. I check an cache first to see if I've already cached that data. And if I haven't, I make a request from the API using their key, not an application-wide key. And then I cache the data for about 30 days. And what do I cache the data under? Not under their user. I cache it under the docket or the document or the comment ID so that anyone else that goes and does that doesn't have to go and get it, right? Pretty simple. And it works pretty well because, again, I have a relatively small user base and it's not too bad. But a lot of times they do have to actually kind of wait, especially for those ones that are 200,000 comments. Basically, they just wait and I just churn. I just churn in the background and I let them know where I'm at. And that's as much as I can do right now. But it solves their need because it still solves a lot of their pain points. Okay, let's talk about some other things about the UI. I've got open data, great. Open source data, how about open source software on the UI side? I want a framework, right? Some framework to build this in. It's not a very complicated site. You'll see it in a minute. So of course I want something open, right? Open source. I probably want it to have a really good base of functionality, modular, things that I can like plug and play in. I want it to be accessible. Because again, we're dealing with government services here. We really want to make this as accessible as possible, well tested, of course, maintained by trusted organizations, something where I know that it's going to keep going. I want a good development velocity, right? I want them to be producing features and whatnot. I really want open source, dealing with government data. How about we use a government maintained open source UI framework? How many people have heard of the US Web Design Standards? Carl, you don't count. Okay, that's pretty good. Actually, I was only expecting like 2. You'll hear from Carl later. He does a lot of web accessibility stuff, and he's obviously interacted a lot with the government stuff. So github.com/USWDS, the web design system. This is maintained also by GSA. Same people that maintain regs.gov. Yeah, I know, little questionable there, but it's actually really good. I've actually committed some stuff there. I've submitted some issues, and they've resolved them in a relatively good amount of time. So now I'm kind of really getting into that government ecosystem, right? Really getting into that civic tech ecosystem. So this is where we're going to try a live demo. So this is the site I created, fedgovregs.org. I have some screenshots just in case this doesn't work, but I think we'll be okay. Maybe. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Come back over here. All right. Real quick, if anyone's curious, this is the Federal Register where you can go and find all of those dockets. And this is my site, although it looks massive here for some reason. But that's all right. We'll just run with it. So this is the site. You can see in the top right that you've got a link to my profile. I'm not going to open that because then you'll see my API key, and I don't want any of you stealing my API key. I only get 1,000 requests an hour. And you can see it's got 936 API calls remaining. So knowing that limit, knowing the pain point, tell the user you've got this pain point, right? And so I identify how many API calls are remaining. And just like you saw in regulations.gov, big call to action, find a docket, right? So let's look up a docket. These ones are actually using regular hyphens, but guess what? My site can handle M dashes in the middle if they had to. It took me 20 seconds to do that, maybe? So we're gonna pull up this EPA whatever docket. I'm on my hotspot, so I'm sure this will go absolutely lovely and super fast. So it pulls up your docket and the main information for your docket. This was really important, and it's already in the background made those requests. Apparently my API calls have started to reset. It's 24-hour period rolling. It's not per 24-hour block. It's a rolling call. So you can see I've made a few in the last 24 hours. You can see these rule documents. So there's the main docket and then all the documents. And you can see that if I go down, there's lots of documents and there's lots of supporting documents. These are actually all really important and critical for my user's problem, for what they're trying to solve. And so I make sure that I actually pull all these back. Now these are just links to the regulations.gov website. I'm not pulling in anything more than I need to, but I'm identifying the critical things that they cared about. Can people comment on that document? That's what they care about. They care about those comments. And then you can see that some of these say no comments here, and then this one says it's got 150 comments. This is a proposed rulemaking. These are the ones that really have a lot of comments, right? I'm going to change the rule or make a new rule or decommission a rule. People comment on it. So the critical functionality we haven't really gotten to yet. Regs.gov can basically do this. It's not really a problem. But notice here, here's what I'm doing. See that loading box? I'm loading up a bunch of comments. And I load these comments over time because in addition to the 1,000 per hour, they have a hidden limit of per second API calls. If I try and send 1,000 at one time, guess what? It doesn't work. So I have to actually load these as the site goes. And as the site goes, I'm loading. If I scroll down, you can see that no comment. There's the loading ones, right? So I'm loading these as it goes. My users really care about, and you can see I've already loaded up the meta information, right? The date it was made and the title and the link. So if they want to jump down and just read one and go right to it, they can do that. They don't have to wait for everything to load to see some of the content. But what they really care about is knowing who did this, the author, and a lot of times the author is blank. That's actually, a lot of times you can see it's actually in here. Great data architecture, right? And you can see that some of these have attachments, some of them have dates. They really cared about that. And you know what they really cared about? A lot of times they only care about comments that have attachments. This is not something you can currently do on regulations.gov, but it was available on the old site. So look at that. Easily filtered down. Oh, now we're 149. Oh, most of them did. A lot of times there are anonymous comments. We can uncheck those. You can also download this index. This index was really critical. It's just a CSV download of all the comments on this document. Absolutely critical for what this user was doing. Used to be available on the old site, not available on the new site. So now we've got that. Awesome. So let's just, this is going to be totally fine. I'm going to reload this page. Right? Because I've cached them. You didn't see the little loading bar anymore, right? Solving my user's problem. They would have to go to regs.gov and click through, if I'm counting correctly, 20, so what is that, 7 pages to get all of this information, where I'm letting them do this with a single click of, hey, show me the comments, right? And caching it so they don't have to do that work again later. So this is how I helped solve their problem, right? I helped solve their problem by listening to their needs and doing a little bit of cajoling of the data and the API. I'm going to skip through these screenshots that I took just in case my demo didn't work, but it did. Yay. So of course, the real point here is how can all of you be civic tech heroes? How can you do that? We already talked about this. Solve a problem. It doesn't have to be everything, right? Find a nonprofit out there that you care about. Talk to some friends who have some pain points. Figure out what they care about, and then build a small solution. Do something so that they can solve their problem through technology. All of you can do this. You can do it in your spare time, or, of course, you can contribute back. We talked about the US web design system. It's open source. Go take a look. They have tons of issues on their site. They're well categorized. You can go and contribute a pull request. There you go. You can be a civic tech hero. You can go to code.gov. Code.gov, kind of like data.gov, but for source code, is where the federal government inventories its source code. It's not perfect. Not everyone does it well, but a lot of organizations actually do post their code here, and a lot of them are in fact open source repositories that you can go and take a look at. Of course, you can raise your voice. You can go to regulations.gov and submit a comment. Now, how are you going to know what to comment on? Don't start at regulations.gov. It will not go well for you. Start on the Federal Register, which allows you to subscribe by topic area, as I mentioned earlier. You can say, I'm curious about data standards. I'm curious about cloud technology. And I would like to know when some government agency is going to make a policy about that so that I can then comment on regulations.gov. But remember, when you copy and paste the docket ID, to remove the em dashes and switch them to hyphens on your own, because apparently they can't do that. And of course, you could join up. My journey started with the US Digital Service, which is run out of the Office of Management and Budget, but that operates across all government agencies. US Digital Response, this is actually a nonprofit organization that provides digital services to state and local, for the most part, state and local governments to help their technology infrastructure. You could join Tech Congress. As it says, it's on the legislative side. Help make tech better for congressional side of things. The US Digital Core is for entry-level technologists who want to come into government, do a stint for 1 or 2 years, and help build up their career in civic technology. There's a great job board, a civic tech job board that a friend of mine named Bill Hunt runs on his site, so I would encourage you to check out that. And 18F, of course, some of you have heard of this, some of you may not. It's kind of similar to the US Digital Service. You come in for a tour of duty from private industry, but it's actually like an internal contractor for the government. So instead of going outside of the government to do contracting, you can actually use government employees and their private industry technologists that actually know what they're talking about and can actually build this stuff better and more sustainably. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you should come talk to me about all the things that we're doing at the Department of Homeland Security to improve citizen and immigration services, to improve the infrastructure and security of our transportation network, and to do things like emergency management through FEMA and things like that. We have lots of openings for technologists that want to make an impact. That's it for me. The slides are here at jordankasper.com/civictech. As I mentioned earlier, you can go to jordankasper.com just to find out all the other weird things that I do. The link to the code is here. Feel free to go there. I do have a couple of open issues if you want to contribute to it that my users have asked for, but I have absolutely no time to do. And if you're really interested about all the horrible things wrong with regulations.gov, you can read this one paper called a 50-page missive that my wife wrote, possibly with some help in terms of technology from Democracy Forward, her nonprofit organization. That's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I won't keep you from lunch any longer.